Cloud. Okay. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining first off, and thank Kartik for organizing all this with everybody else. Our first speaker today will be John Mansfield, and then we'll split into two groups, and then Peter Crozier will talk, as well as Cameron. So our first speaker is John Mansfield. He got his Bachelor of Science in Chemical Physics, and then a Master's of Science and a PhD from the University of Bristol. He served many roles, including director of the Michigan Center for Material Characterization, which is abbreviated MC². I find that pretty amusing. He currently serves as editor-in-chief for Microscopy and Microanalysis. His research focuses on advanced microscopy techniques for chemical, morphological, and crystallographic characterization of a wide variety of materials. And now I'll let him take the floor if he would like to tell us any more about himself, or just go into the presentation.
Okay, well, I'll pop the presentation up, make sure that everybody can see it. Okay. There are too many buttons here. Okay, so here we go. So yeah, I'm John Mansfield. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal Microscopy and Microanalysis. And my microscope research doesn't actually amount to much these days since I'm retired. My major research is actually trying to improve the profile of the journal and encourage people more submissions and subscribers. And to that end, I'm going to actually tell you a little bit about how you get your paper published in a journal and how a journal works. And if you've got any questions, you can interrupt me along the way. Is it possible for them to do that?
Yeah, they can raise their hands and then I can unmute them.
Okay.
There's a raise hand thing in the...
Well, can they send a group chat?
Yes, they could also do that. I'll keep an eye on that.
So, wait a minute, there's something weird with my presentation here. Just 1 second. Okay, as we were. Right. So, as I said, I'm the editor-in-chief, and I'll talk a little bit about the journal. So, I've already said what I am. Microscopy and Microanalysis, as you may not already know, is the journal, the official journal of the Microscopy Society of America, the Microanalysis Society, and a host of other societies across the world. We have a sizable editorial board and a number of editors. Some of you may be familiar with them, as they're displayed here on the right-hand side of the slide. I actually have to move everybody's pictures off the slide so I can see what I'm talking about. As I said, you may be familiar with these folks. I have a mixture of people from Europe, the United States and Australia, and some folks from industry, and mostly people from universities. What we're going to talk about in the presentation today is, right, the topics covered in this is a sort of basically shotgun style. There's a lot of things that I can talk about, and some of them I'll talk about in more depth than others. But this is a rough outline, a bit of an introduction, a little bit about how journals are structured, how to write a paper, how to submit it, and essentially get it published without too much problem, and what sort of formatting and what sort of detail you have to pay attention to, and how you should deal with authors and reviewers and the journal. Okay, so if you actually look at scientific presentations these days, there's an amazing number. This slide is stolen shamelessly from one of our competitors, Angus Kirkland, who's the editor-in-chief of Elsevier's Ultra Microscopy. And he and I did a presentation at the International Conference back in Sydney last year, and I've stolen this slide because it tells you a little bit, gives you those sort of mind-blowing statistics here. There are apparently about 5,000 scientific journal publishers and about 30,000 peer-reviewed scholarly journals. 2.5 million published articles a year and about 4 million authors. So that's a rather large community, and you might be excused for sort of being a little bit leery about where you actually might publish, who you might publish with, and you might actually be sort of scared away from the whole concept. But anyway, let's see what we can do to allay your fears and convince you that publishing in a journal such as ours is a good idea, because it's a very focused area and there's a lot of people likely to read your work. The top 4 publishers are all big commercial publishers, and we're in one of the smaller publishing houses, Cambridge University Press, which is a non-profit, which helps quite a bit. And I'll talk a little bit. I don't want to sort of try slam other publishers. I just want to sort of make what I think is pertinent remarks about sort of publishing in this day and age. Because modern scientific publishing is moving away from this idea of the journal, sort of print copy. I've got dozens of these things sitting on my desk. I mean, I actually have 5 copies of every issue of the journal, so I've got lots of them. And they're big, they're heavy, and I don't know how many of you actually read the paper copy these days. I know that a number of my older colleagues read the paper copies, but I suspect that many of the younger community actually read online in the form of PDFs, and are always searching for sort of copies of journals in archives, like archive.org, and expect to see that the whole thing will move in that general direction and go away from print. How long that will actually be, we don't know. We are still continuing with print for as long as we foresee at the moment. So there's also things like ResearchGate, which I guess you could probably call the scientific social media, although I am told that the younger generation, if you'll forgive me for using that expression, are quite keen on communicating massive amounts of information on Twitter these days, although how you would actually communicate a journal publication on Twitter is beyond me, unless you actually just embed a link, which I guess we do anyway. But at the moment, I'm going to talk about a little bit more traditional publishing. The sort of publishing cycle involves sort of the editors, an editor-in-chief, the publishers, the editorial office. And this slide is quite messy. There's a lot of arrows pointed to and from. And I'm not going to sit here and explain it to you, because I'm just going to go through the basic sort of processes of publishing a paper, right? And first of all, I'm going to sort of highlight the people who are involved, who all these sort of individual folks are. And so the publisher is the, I've already mentioned people like Elsevier, Cambridge University Press. And what do? Well, they basically, in some of the major journals, they appoint the editors and the editorial board. But in our scientific society journal, we actually have a lot more control. The society, scientists actually have control over who the editors and the editorial boards are. And they're actually appointed by the executive management of the society in collaboration with the existing editors, the previous editors, and so on. And so there's a lot more sort of control from the point of view of the society when it comes to managing the journal. But we still have to have the publisher to do things like managing the production of the journal, actually getting it tagged, archived, printed and distributed and sold. The idea of it actually being sold for a large amount of money is something that is a bone of contention, because of the way that many universities feel that they pay for research. They pay the researchers to do the research. The researchers then write the papers for free, essentially give them to the journals, and the journals then charge them for reading that said journal. And so the push for open access and what have you has become very strong, but open access still means that you actually have to pay for the publication of the article, because somehow somebody's got to pay for actually getting the thing up online or getting the thing into print. And I'm not going to go into the sort of nasty details of that, but suffice to say, I think Cambridge University Press has a very good idea of how to negotiate and navigate the idea of open access without it costing them a lot of money, and without it costing us a lot of money. So we'll just hope, keep our fingers crossed and hope that we are definitely with the right publisher. So what are my responsibilities, or what are the responsibilities of editors in general? We define the aims and the scope of the journal, again in consultation with the society. We communicate with the authors and the reviewers, and we handle new submissions. In the case of microscopy and microanalysis, which, as you see from now on, will be referred to quite frequently as MAM, because it is quite a lengthy thing to say. In our case, we actually have such a broad range of subjects that we cover. We actually have appropriate editors for the subject matter of the manuscript. So you saw that big list of editors that I have working with me, and that's because we have people in biology, we have people in cultural heritage, we have people in metallurgy, we have TEM specialists, we have scan probe specialists, focused ion beam specialists. And so dependent on the subject of the article, that the manuscript that arrives, then it will actually be assigned to an editor whose general knowledge is in that field. Okay. We accept or reject the papers, and we advise on strategy and direction of the journal with the society and the editorial board. And the editorial board is who I want to talk up next. They're basically the advisory board that sits above the editors and works in collaboration with the society. Ideally, they're published by the they're appointed by the publisher in some cases, but in our case, they're actually they're appointed by the editor and the executive committee, the executives of the society. They tend to be experts in the subfield of the journal, okay? And a lot like the editors, they can be consulted if there's something in the publication stream that, God forbid, the editors themselves do not understand. We can look to them for their expertise. They're expected to, what I would call, evangelize the journal, which is sort of talk it up and encourage people to publish in it. And ideally, we expect them to publish in the journal when they have material that fits the scope of the journal. And there are a number of members of our editorial board who are very, very good at this. Examples being Gracie Burke in Manchester, Mark de Graaf at Carnegie Mellon. They publish quite frequently in our journal. The board can suggest topics for special issues or review papers, and basically they can advise me on strategy and future direction. Basically, the idea is that they are around to make sure that the journal functions in the manner that it's supposed to. Okay. So, what type of articles do we publish in our journal? Okay, there are a whole variety of different articles that different journals publish, but I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to talk about the journal that I know about the most, which is our journal. And we have sort of full, original, regular articles. In fact, we tend to call them original articles. When they're published, they come up with a banner that says original article. We actually have review articles. You can see on the slide here. I have 3 screens in front of me here, and so I have to move the one screen that sat in front of the 2 big ones. So you'll have to excuse me. So here's an example of an article if this was an original article, it would just say original here. This is a review article that will come out in the June issue of the journal that is about to actually come online in the next few days. And in print, it will follow in about a week's time. Colin Office from the Molecular Foundry at Lawrence Berkeley has done a really, really nice job of 4D STEM review. And I encourage you to run out and read that immediately. We do micrographia, so we've got regular articles, which are regular scientific papers that you're reporting your research, analysis, microscopy and microanalysis of materials, be they biological materials or hard materials. The review articles, and then micrographia is a section of the journal that we are going to spin off in the not too distant future. That is actually going to be a separate online journal that will be probably completely open access. We haven't completely figured that out yet, but we're working on it. And it's more for descriptive microscopy without a lot of protracted microanalysis. It would be actually presentation of interesting micrographs and images for the most part. We have letters to the editor when people actually take one another to task on technical or scientific points in an article. And these letters to the editor have to be quite carefully written and sent to me. I then give the person that they're basically complaining about an opportunity to actually respond. And we end up sort of publishing sort of letters to the editor and letters to the editor that are rebuttals of letters to the editor if necessary. We don't do too many of these because we assume that most of our publications are concisely enough written that there isn't anything that people would complain about too much. And if it's something that they want to complain about a great deal, they write another paper and sort of express a different point of view. That's the idea of scientific publication. We also have book reviews. You can see there's an example of a book review down here. Can you guys see my pointer?
Yes, and I think Cameron has a question.
I can't hear you, Cameron. You're muted.
Oh, hey, I have a quick question for you. Regarding the letters of editor, I know that eLife, for example, you can see the reviewer's comments on, and that's been a great means of like discussion and understanding a scope of a paper. Is that something like how do you see that fitting into the future of publishing? Like, do you see that as something other journals will adopt, or is it kind of a trap that I don't understand?
So sorry, say that again. You could see reviewers' comments where?
Oh yeah. So eLife, the journal eLife.
Okay.
When you log on to read the article that's published there, you can also see the reviewer's comments, which is nice because it gives us really good context for scope of an article, particularly if it's an area I'm unfamiliar with. So I found that as really helpful. And I was thinking,
that's quite interesting. We've not actually thought about doing that, but if can you drop me an email reminding me about that so that I can actually talk to my other colleagues about it? I've not thought about doing it, and I don't know exactly how we would do it. Online, it would be probably fairly easy because you could have pop-ups or pop-outs. Not thought about it. We don't currently do it, but that does not mean that we wouldn't at some point if it was a popular thing to think about.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
Anything else?
No, that was my only question.
Okay. So we got these various article types, and basically we're really looking at full articles, review articles, or descriptive articles. That's in our journal. If you actually want to publish your research work, you actually have to sit down and think about where you want your material to reach. I mean, everybody would love to have their stuff always published in Nature and everybody in the world read it. I think the catch there is that Nature tends to be this enormous, great umbrella journal, and I don't think as many of the people in a sort of focused region of a particular scientific endeavor would necessarily read it on a routine basis. I mean, if you're a particular material, if you're a real sort of materials person and you're looking at the materials, then you might end up in something like the Journal of Material Science. Here, when it comes to us, we're Microscopy and Microanalysis. We publish microscopy-related stuff. So basically, if you've actually attacked a material science or a biological science problem with a multitude of different microscopy techniques, we love that because it's the microscopy that is the focus. If you're developing a new microscopy technique, we love that. That's the focus again, microscopy. If you're developing software or hardware that advances the field of microscopy, that's what we're interested in. If you actually send us, in fact, very often, if you send us a paper that is basically a metallurgical study of something that has a couple of scanning electron micrographs in it, we will actually encourage you to send it to a journal that is more appropriate. Okay, we are Microscopy and Microanalysis. If you have a paper that focuses heavily on microscopy and microanalysis, we would like to see it, but we don't want everything because A, we can't publish a massive number, and B, we actually try and publish what is specifically focused in our area. Okay, so what you need to do is you want to decide whether you want to actually be read by your peers or whether you want a broad multidisciplinary audience. If you think it's something that is so fantastic that everybody in the world will be talking about it, maybe you should shoot for Nature. But then again, they can be quite picky and you could end up having it be sent back. So you really need to look at the aims and scope of the journals that you're looking for. The impact factor, if you're really into actually having a massive impact factor, then you can chase the big impact factor journals. But again, you actually end up in my opinion, having a smaller audience than if you actually pick a journal that is a little bit more focused. Okay, so journals that publish work on a similar subject to yours, similar novelty to yours, and whether it's fundamental or applied. As I said, we actually have fundamental microscopy research and applied microscopy work. So there are reasons to not publish with us, but there are strong reasons to publish with us if your work is very, very strongly microscopy and microanalysis focused. And you can look at the different kinds of articles. As I said, we do regular articles and review papers. We tend to have review papers are invited only. But if you come to us and say, hey, I've got this really great idea, I want to review this area of the field, and we haven't seen anything like that recently, then we'll be glad to sort of talk to you about it. Okay? So once you've chosen a journal for submission, right, you really need to read the instructions. This is not a case of where you can just avoid reading the manual, because this is something that will really tick off the people in the publishing, the editors and the journal if you don't follow the rules, right? So you need to read the guide for authors or the author information pack or whatever it is, right? And check out all the requirements, whether there's certain layout, whether there's a page limit, what the rules are about abbreviations, how the references should be formatted, how the figures should be laid out, so on. At this point, I'm going to switch back to, and also supplementary material. And I'm going to switch back and focus again on microscopy and microanalysis and give you specific examples. This slide, the picture on this page is actually the cover of the June issue. So you can see all of the different 4D STEM techniques that Colin's going to talk about in his lengthy article. I'm really quite excited about this because it's a really nice review article. That's why I keep going on about it. So for microscopy and microanalysis, there are some very sort of key things, right? The papers are published in English. It might seem that that's a bit obvious, but even scientists actually in English-speaking countries are famous for not really having very high skills in English composition. And so you should pay particular attention to the rules of grammar and punctuation. People don't know how to use don't know how to use this little guy very well, semicolons. You can avoid using semicolons completely if you wish. And in fact, if you're not used to using them, and I'd encourage you not to use them. One of the infuriating things is people not defining abbreviations and acronyms. This is why I've highlighted this, right? And if you, of course, it saves you typing if you actually define these at the first time and then you use them consistently thereafter in the manuscript. We actually have this thing about the whole thing being typed, double spaced and so on. And you think, oh, this is a hangover from the time when we used to take paper submissions. Yes, in a way, but when we actually have Word documents, remember people are going to be reading them online. They need to, when they pop up on the screen, they need to be well spaced and be relatively easy to read. I tend to favor sans serif fonts, but we don't make any dictation about which font you should actually use. The manuscripts really should be readable and editable. So we really like to see them in either Microsoft Word format or in TeX format, LaTeX. And that means that I can actually edit them. In fact, in the not too distant future, we will actually have an integration of something called OpenLeaf into the submission, the Scholar One submission site that we use, such that you would be able to edit and submit TeX articles a lot more easily. LaTeX will be sort of basically embedded into the system. For those of you who prefer Word, that's absolutely fine. But we actually like to see the manuscripts in either of those formats. And the figures should all be separate, okay? And they need to be as high resolution as possible. So there are 4 reasons why people's papers get sent back, okay? First of all, they don't actually send the files in the right format. We get some word processing format that we can't read, so those go back automatically. The figures are embedded into a word processing document, are low resolution, and when they would be reproduced would be horrible, okay? The references are numbered instead of alphabetically ordered, and what's the other one? Well, if the abstract doesn't read properly in English, then the chances are that the rest of the document isn't going to read properly in English, and so that will actually cause it to be sent back too. Okay, so I'm not going to read all this. I'm going to actually make this available for anybody that wants it, and you can then ask for sort of further details or further explanation if you wish. The thing that I'm saying is that there are some things that we absolutely, definitely have to have. And if the manuscript doesn't follow this general format, introduction, materials, methods, results, discussion, and summary or conclusions, with any acknowledgements and references following, then we tend to send it back. If you don't follow this sort of fairly rigorous format, then the paper can be very rambling and difficult to understand. So we basically mandate that anything other than a review needs to be in this format, okay? Other things to remember, right? You want your paper to be published, and we want original and attractive papers in the journal. The reviewers want to be able to read novel and technically sound and scientifically sound papers, right? And the readers that are going to be reading the journal want to know the latest advances. So that's what you're shooting for. Focus on your message to the reader, and you want to convince the editor and the reviewers that this is publishable material, but don't oversell it, don't exaggerate it, right? Remember that the editors and reviewers hate wasting time on poorly written, poorly prepared, grammatically incorrect manuscripts, and they go straight back to the authors really, really quickly, okay? So these are the things that you have to remember. Now, when you actually want to submit your paper, we actually have, we actually use Scholar One Manuscripts, which is a manuscript submission site that many other journals use. I think the Materials Research Society at least uses Scholar One, and maybe even the Journal of Material Science. But anyway, the login for this, the reason I put this page up is you'll notice down at the bottom here that we actually have a thing, an optional login these days, login with Orchid ID, okay? Sorry, Orchid. Orchid IDs are sort of repetitive, but Orchid. So many journals are insisting on people actually having verified IDs for their authors. And Cambridge is one of those that's actually moving in that direction in the not too distant future. So if you've never heard of Orchid, then I suggest you actually Google it and find out how to sign up. It basically gives you, it's like having the sort of credentials. It's like showing your sort of membership card to the scientific community when you actually try and submit a paper. And so that will be something that will be standard soon. When you log into our site and you want to actually submit, if you choose the author submission site and say you want to submit a manuscript, the submission sites in general, and Scholar One is no exception, they take you step by step. They basically feed you through the system. They try and make it as simple as possible. But if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact the editor-in-chief, because sometimes it's not completely plain to everybody. So you're more than welcome to email me if you actually have any questions. Okay. Now, with modern day online material, you could actually have the luxury of providing a lot more information than in a typical paper. And you can include supportive and supplementary information if it's interesting and it complements your manuscript. But it's not absolutely essential to the manuscript. Now, of course, if it's essential to the manuscript, it should be in the manuscript, right? But if it's something that actually supports the manuscript, we can actually allow you to publish it online, particularly things like moving images and movies. Obviously, you can't put that in print, and so that's very attractive, okay? And so the idea of video or audio data is attractive. We don't have much in the way of a size limit currently on the supplementary material, okay? And when we put it up online, although the editor and reviewers read it and will modify some of the more egregious grammatical or scientific issues in those files, they're not actually really edited very much other than that. And they're not converted into web friendly. They're not put in as HTML or excuse that typo there, it should be or PDF. And so you should make sure that the thing is clear and well laid out if you're actually going to supply supplementary information. And if it's optional, you don't have to do it, and only include it if it's really supportive, or if somebody said, oh, you don't need to put all this in the main document, you could put it as supplementary material. So you can actually discuss that with the editor, okay? Ethical concerns. I could spend an entire 45 minutes talking about ethical concerns, right? The field of scientific inquiry is getting more and more competitive. One might say cutthroat, and you really need to be honest and very straightforward with what you do. You need to go through the submission process, make sure that you declare that this is your work and the work of your co-authors. Make sure your co-authors agree with what you are saying. Make sure your co-authors have actually indeed read the manuscript. We have had many cases where people say, oh, I didn't even know that was being submitted. That's exactly not very professional way of going on. And also beware of plagiarism, right? Including self-plagiarism. You can't lift a piece of one paper that you've written and paste it into another, even though it's your work, okay? If you do something like that, you have to quote, put it in quotes and reference it. I cannot count the number of times where people have actually submitted papers to us that we've then run through something like Authenticate, which is basically a online plagiarism checking program, and it pulls up an article that exists in an archive somewhere or online somewhere that's got large chunks of identical material in it and has not even been referenced in the current paper. And so that sort of thing is grounds for rejection straight away. If you're not honest when you submit your document, then you're likely to get it sent back to you. Okay? I can't emphasize enough that obviously there are cases where you may not be aware of something, okay? But if it's your own work, self-plagiarism and not mentioning the previously published or archived documents is just unconscionable. So when you submit your manuscript, it's got quite a long route through the system, and I've tried to simplify that diagram that I showed earlier on by saying that basically you submit the manuscript, we check that it's in the format that we like, follows all of our rules. If the technical requirements are met, then your paper is assigned to the editor-in-chief, who makes a first assessment, okay? That first assessment will sort of, take into account earlier submissions by the author, whether there's been any cases of self-plagiarism, whether it actually matches the journal's aims and scope, make sure the structure's right, make sure there's readability, and a brief inspection of the scientific merit. And then the editor-in-chief, me in this case, assigns the paper to one of our subject editors, who then invites reviewers for the manuscript. Ideally 3 people, but at least 2. And we want to get that out to those reviewers within the first couple of weeks of actually handling the article. Okay, the peer reviewers evaluate the scientific content of your paper, respond to the subject editor, and recommend rejection, revision, or acceptance. Okay, and the subject editor will recommend acceptance, revision, or rejects the manuscript. Okay, so basically what happens is if he or she wants it reviewed, revised, then it goes back to the authors for either major or minor revisions, then comes back, is re-reviewed, and it can go round this circle several times, okay? Because there are some people that will sort of nitpick and make sure they get things absolutely right. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then we can sort of recommend accept or reject, okay? Now, in our journal, if the subject editor decides to reject the paper, it will be returned to the author without going through me, okay? Because we trust that the subject editor knows at least as much as I do, if not more typically, on that particular area. And if the reviews come back and the subject editor recommends rejection, then it goes back to the author. If the subject editor recommends acceptance and it comes through to me, I can still read it and I can still reject it and send it back to the author. There have been cases where this has occurred. It's not common, but it has happened. Typically, one would expect this at this point for the editor-in-chief to say, this is good, edits it, sends it to Cambridge University Press, who then sends it out to the typesetters, etc. Okay, so let's just consider the reviewer's process. Remember, if you're a reviewer, and I stick this in because as scientists, once you start publishing, you're likely to get requests to be reviewers on any material that comes in your general subject area. So you have to sort of pay attention to the reviewing process, right? Is the topic in the scope of the journal? Is there the right level of novelty and newness? Is the science sensible? Is there a good reference list? Is it well balanced? I mean, there's nothing worse than people actually with referencing themselves alone. Self-referencing is not sort of exactly encouraged to the exclusion of all else. Research questions clearly formulated and addressed. Good abstract and conclusions. Did the experiments make sense? Are the figures and tables clear? And in the case of the microscopy journal, are the images sharp, clear, and in focus? That's one of the key issues. You would not believe the number of times I have to send back papers. In fact, we've seen quite well-written, sensible, cogent manuscripts actually rejected because you can't really see what you're looking for in the images. The authors may believe they can see it, but if we can't see it and the data is shoddy, we will reject it, okay? And so this is the sort of thing you would consider if you were a reviewer, and this is the sort of thing that you should expect your reviewers to be considering, right? And if you're actually going to do a review, you should make sure that you're polite and objective and give clear recommendations to the author, to the editor, so that they can pass them on to the author. You get the chance to recommend, to write recommendations and comments to the editor alone, and recommendations and comments that you can send to the author. There have been cases where reviewers who are anonymous actually reveal themselves because they communicate with the authors and actually get involved with improving the paper. And there's many cases where I've seen acknowledgements in manuscripts that actually thank the reviewers for improving the quality of the publication, so that of the manuscript, so it actually makes it into publication. And one of the things is, if you review, then remember that you should do it as quickly as possible, as quickly as you can. I know everybody's busy, but remember the authors are very anxiously waiting your response. You know, if you've actually published or you've sent a paper off to a journal, you know what this is like, okay? So once you get we'll switch back to being the author now. And if you get a reviewer's report, you should carefully read the reviewer's comments and the editor's comments, and be open-minded. Don't take it personally. They're not making personal attacks on you, although there have been cases of this, and then you have to basically take that up with the editor-in-chief. But let's not discuss that because it's very rare. Okay? But don't respond directly. Mull over. Sit and think about what you need to know to do. Be polite. Don't be confrontational. And when you actually submit your revised manuscript, respond to all the points that the reviewers and the editors have made, even if you disagree. If you think they're full of wet hay, you can say so and you can have a discussion about it. But just to ignore it is not satisfactory, because if somebody says, I really think that this should be done, and then you ignore it and don't do it, they will just point that out again and some people will end up then with rejecting papers if you don't actually establish a dialogue with them. Okay.
Hey, John?
Yes?
A few more minutes so that we have time for questions as well.
Yeah, let's see. I'm on slide 26 of 29. Is that all right?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Sorry. I tend to get away. Okay. One of the things about the decisions is less than 50% of papers are accepted, which means that a lot more than 50% are rejected. If you get accepted, celebrate, move on with your research. If you don't get it accepted, you get rejected, don't dismay. Everybody gets that. Either submit it to another journal, or if the editor may say, hey, send this to a different journal. If you do, then you actually have to make sure that you read the guidelines of that journal. Make sure you don't fall into any of the traps there. You may have a different scope or different audience in a different journal. Once you've been accepted, then the manuscript goes out of the submission review site to the publication editor of the journal. They look at the format of the files and the integrity of the manuscript, make sure everything is there. And at that point, they assign a DOI, or digital object identifier. This is the thing that actually makes sure that the document can always be found on the internet, whatever. And you can read more about this on doi.org. But a DOI, for example, is here. If I click on this, it's going to launch my browser and take us to one of our articles. So I'm not going to do that. The proof version, proof version of your manuscript will appear online. We're actually working on an online proof editor. At the moment, people download them and edit them, but we're working on an online proof editor that's coming in the not too distant future. When the proof's approved by the author and the EIC, the article's planned for a future issue. It will appear online in what's known as First View. That's a Cambridge University word for online publication prior to being assembled into a volume. And when a volume comes out, it disappears off First View and ends up in the volume of record and ends up online in the journal's repository. Okay? Last slide basically says questions. So, and as I say, I'm pushing the new issue that should be out by now. I think it should be out by the end of the week. I know it's not June yet, but the Cambridge told me that they would actually publish prior to the month if they have all the documents and everything is in line. So,
wonderful. Thank you so much, John. If you have any questions, just type something in the chat and then I'll unmute you.
Now, if I could see the chat window, that would be really good.
At the bottom of the screen next to where there was the share, if you click chat.
Yeah, the problem is that I'm going to have to stop the share. You know. Oh, I found it. Wait a minute. No, do you want me to stop the share?
That would be good. Thank you. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Just go ahead and type them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask it.
Oh, how many submissions do we get in a typical month? Is that Ethan?
That's Ethan.
Ethan, okay. It varies a great deal. We get about 300 submissions per year, and they come in at varying speeds. It depends upon around about the sort of Christmas period. Things are kind of slow, you know, between Thanksgiving and the middle of January. Mm-hmm. But as other than that, you can pretty much divide the rest of the year. So sort of 11 months into 300, and that's how many manuscripts we get per month. Does that answer your question? Cameron?
I have one more question. So a lot of the audience here today is students and graduate students. As a publisher, when do you think is the ideal time for graduate students to start engaging in the publishing process? Because I think a lot of times it's in sort of manuscript preparation, but we don't really get the opportunity to see the back end. So where do you see is that ideal timing?
What, when you should start publishing?
No, like being involved in, we're not often the corresponding author. So yeah. How do you see engaging with your PI so you can start to see those sort of back ends of things and whatnot? Where in your graduate career do you see as sort of the ideal time for students to start participating in that?
Well, obviously, when you actually have data that you've analyzed and you believe is important, then it's the time to start nagging your supervisor, advisor, PI, to say, I think there's enough here for a paper. And typically the supervisor is going to turn around and say, yeah, but you need to do this one extra experiment first. Or they might say, yeah, this is fine, but I don't agree with that analysis, right?
Yeah.
And or they might just say, go away and write it up.
Okay.
And come back, and you've written it up, and they will then look at it and say, oh my God, you can't write English. No, I mean, there are all sorts. I mean, I suspect I've heard a lot. I'm going to say nice things about Peter Crozier now, and he's not going to actually understand how I'm doing that. But I've heard that Peter's a really great advisor, right? but I suspect that he's not a pushover. He won't let you sort of just get away with anything. I guess Ethan can probably answer that question, but I know that if you go to him with a sort of cogent piece of work that is actually, he will know roughly what you've been doing, right? And so if you go to him and say, we need to publish this, don't you think? Very often advisors will sort of sit there and wait a little bit and see where it defines how sort of a student is going to survive in the scientific community if they know when to go and push the buttons and say, yeah, we should do this, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, sort of halfway through your graduate career, roughly, when you've actually when you've passed prelims and done all sort of written exams and the sort of the tedious stuff, and you've actually started to do the fun stuff, then and you actually are getting data and you've got a story you can tell, that's the time to start talking to publishing. But again, what will typically happen is the boss will tell you to write it up. You will be the first author, your collaborators will be in the middle, and the boss will be the last author.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And typically they will be the corresponding author because they know how to deal with the likes of me.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay. If we don't have any more questions, then we will break into two groups, one being the physical science and one being bio. And I will paste a Zoom link for the biosciences in the chat. So you can just join that one now. And Cameron, Mike will be the host of that, and Cameron will be presenting. Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. Am I muted? No, I'm not muted. John, how you said you wanted to share those slides. How do we go about that?
I can dump them to a PDF. They're not a PowerPoint. They're a keynote.
Yeah,
and
if you want to.
I can spit it out to a PDF if you like and send it to you.
Yeah, that would be great. You can send it to me or Cameron. And then
Okay.
I'll email you to get that.
Fair enough.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
All right. So then we will go ahead and get started on the physical science side. Looks like we just had a few more people join. So giving the presentation today will be Peter Crozier. He's a professor and graduate chair, material science at Arizona State University. He got his education first in physics, and then he got a PhD in physics again from Glasgow. Peter serves on the editorial board for Micron and Microscopy Today, as well as he holds a position as treasurer for the Microscopy Society of America. Let Peter take over now and tell us more about himself, or go right into the presentation.
Okay, Eric, thanks very much. I think maybe since we're running a bit late, I'll just go straight to the presentation. So I'm going to just, let me see, I'm going to share my screen. Tell me if, Eric, did that work?
It did, but it is not in the presentation mode yet.
Hang on, let me try this. How's that?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So, and thanks for coming on to this webinar. So, they've asked me to give a presentation on how to give a presentation for a platform, a talk at a conference. And so I'm going to try and go a little bit fast because of the time that we're behind. And talk, first of all, a little bit generally on how to give a good presentation. And I think if you think about what makes a presentation interesting to you, very often a great talk, if you're listening to a good talk, you'll be hearing about something that's beautiful or very useful. Those are the kind of things that we like. If you see beautiful images or something that you find very useful. Or if you don't have those elements to present, just telling a great story can really capture the audience. So you could have two people giving the same basic material, and one person would make it really, really interesting, and the other person would perhaps make it a little bit boring. So you want to think in terms of storytelling when you're giving a talk. And I know that especially those of you that may have not done this before, that it's quite stressful to give your first conference talk, and you're worried about a lot of technical details and what are the questions going to be, and you want to make sure that all the data that you're presenting is correct. And all of those things, of course, are it's important to get right. But once you've got all of that technical stuff taken care of, remember to think about your audience, and your audience really likes to hear you tell a good story. So what are the kind of things that make it work if you want to really connect with your audience? So when you're giving a talk, it's really about communication. You're trying to establish a link with your audience. And so in general, the most important thing to know, first of all, is who your audience actually is. So are you talking to undergraduates or graduate students or scientists or industry managers or politicians or school children? And depending on who you're talking to, you can take the message and modify it and modify the way it's presented so that you can establish contact with the audience. And I think it's very important to recognize that it's your responsibility to connect with the audience. You know, sometimes people say, well, I said that during my talk and, you know, you weren't listening properly, but really it's the responsibility of the speaker to try and engage and keep the audience alert. And of course, I'm a university professor and have lectured to students for years, and so I know what the problems are here. It's quite a good assumption to assume that your audience are bored and are going to fall asleep. And that's really the attitude you should have, even though you think your material is so interesting and fascinating. Very often your audience have their mind elsewhere. And so the challenge is, how do you keep them awake and how do you keep them engaged so that they'll not fall asleep or not check their Snapchat or whatever it is they're going to do instead of listening to you. I think that it's important to try and really grab the audience's attention and make sure that the audience can understand what you're trying to say the first time they hear it. Remember, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but typically at a conference, the slide is only up for 1 minute. And so they don't have a lot of time to assimilate a lot of complex details. And so it's really important that you, let me just turn this pointer on. Can you see the laser pointer, Eric? That's showing? Yeah. It's really important that you avoid cluttering up people's heads with unnecessary arguments. So abbreviations, for example, are often not required in a talk because you're only going to mention the technique once. So you don't need to give these abbreviations, which often people get confused about. And you're really aiming for information efficiency, even though you've spent a huge amount of time on this project and you've done a lot of checks and balances. The audience are not interested in that. They just want to know the minimum amount of information that they need in order to understand your arguments and to arrive at the conclusion. So this is called information efficiency. And I'm not sure if this shows up here. I have the dogs and cats. Anyway, you know, you want to avoid trying to show off how smart you are, because in fact, people are not impressed by that. They just find it annoying. So again, by being efficient in the amount of information that you present, you'll connect with the audience, and the audience will stay engaged. Remember the times you've sat through talks and the speaker is giving a huge amount of information and you just go to sleep. You just tune out. So you want to avoid information overload, and you want to be as efficient as possible so that you can keep the person following what you're saying. Now, switching now to the conference talk, I thought I would talk about the so-called 12-minute conference talk. So that's like the M&M type of talk or the Materials Research Society talk. So very often you're given 12 to 15 minutes. And that's, you know, quite a short period of time to try and get important points across. And again, remembering this information efficiency concept, the rule of thumb is that you have 1 slide per minute. So if you have a 12-minute conference talk, roughly you can think about preparing something like 12 slides. And during the talk, you should probably really aim at communicating 2 primary points, and it's important to be clear on what you want to communicate. Your topic might be very complicated, and there may be lots of points that you can make, but you have to sort of prioritize what you think are the 2 most important points that you want the audience to understand, and then you have to shape your presentation to make sure that they understand those 2 points at the end. There might be a couple of secondary points as well, but you really want to make sure that you hit the audience with 1 or 2 primary points. And here's just a rough layout of how a 12-minute conference talk might be. So you would have 1 title slide, and you want to make the title informative. Maybe a couple of slides on general background of the project, and maybe 1 slide on what the goals is. What are you doing and why are you doing it? And then slides 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 would be the approaches that you're using. So you're using electron microscopy or EDX or EELS, whatever it happens to be. And then perhaps something on how you analyze the data, so what are you going to do to the data? And then slide 9 might be the results, and of course you might have more than 1 results slide. And then 10 and 11 would be the interpretation. So what does this all mean? And then finally you would have a summary and a conclusion. So it's not a lot of slides, it's not a lot of content, and again, you can see why I'm suggesting that you really decide, how many messages do you want to get across? And generally speaking, the more messages you try to get across in a presentation, the harder it is. A very skilled speaker might be able to get 3 or 4 points across in a 12-minute talk, but that talk will have to be designed and engineered in a very careful way so that the audience actually understand. But generally speaking, it's better to aim for a couple of points. Don't read out long narratives. I think you want to go for good graphics, bullets. Try to avoid long sentences, even though I'm using them in this, and you'll see why I use them in this in a few minutes. So there is this discussion about how many words should you have per slide, and certainly we have these discussions in my group all the time. If you go to some corporate tutor on how to do a good presentation, they'll tell you to be very economical with words and try to avoid putting sentences and too many words on your slide. And certainly the most beautiful slides are the slides that have a few words. The difference for what you're doing at a conference presentation is that many people at the conference don't have English as their first language. And in fact, many of them coming in may struggle to understand rapidly spoken English. So if you have no words on your slide and it's all just figures and you're relying on the audience to hear the words that you're speaking, you may not communicate with the people from overseas that are struggling with English. And very often what you find is people can read English very often better than they can comprehend spoken English because of how they learn it. And so I would say that when you're doing these presentations, you have to sort of balance making a very beautiful slide with very few words with one that actually communicates more broadly with your audience. And in fact, when I go overseas to give presentations, I often take my beautiful slides and put lots of words on them because I know if I don't do that, I won't communicate with the audience. So remember, the most important objective of this presentation is not to make a beautiful slide, it's to communicate with the audience. And you have to always keep focused on that point and modify the slides to make sure that you're communicating. If you're speaking to an English-only audience, then you don't need many words. They'll understand spoken English. But usually at scientific meetings, a substantial fraction, something like 1/3 of the audience will be from overseas. Imagine you're a graduate student coming in from China or Brazil and you're struggling with English and you're struggling with the science. If you sit through a talk where there's no words on the slide, you might not understand anything. So you have to try and be aware of that and adapt to the situation. This might be obvious to some of you, may not be to others, but whenever you're showing graphs and charts, it's very important that they be labeled correctly. You want to use large fonts, bullet points. The thing that you want to be careful about is lifting a graph or a chart straight out of a scientific paper, because very often that presentation in the paper acknowledges the fact that you can spend a lot of time looking at the graph and the chart, whereas when you're showing a chart in a presentation, the audience have to understand it in 1 minute. So that means that you need to modify what you're showing from what you might have put in a paper. Of course, in order to keep the audience engaged, having beautiful pictures coming up. In fact, sometimes what I do is if I've gone through a few slides where the content is a little bit dry, you know, maybe words and graphs, if you can throw in a few pictures to wake the audience up and re-engage them, that can be helpful. And of course, because we're doing microscopy, usually it's easy to come up with something like that. Another way to try and re-engage your audience is to use humor. If you think they're going to sleep, you can add some humor. You do need to be a little bit careful with humor. Everybody doesn't have the same sense of humor. So you need to sort of be a little bit discreet in what you do and also pay attention to the context. So this one here, I'm not sure if you can read the words here, but you know, there's two issues about this. One is it doesn't really fit into a scientific presentation, and you know, having a religious theme in humor, that's an area where you have to be very careful, because something that one person might find amusing, somebody else might find offensive. So humor can be used, you just need to be careful with how you do it. Delivery tips, you have all these slides and you go off to the conference. Those of you that have been to conferences have no doubt witnessed the situation where somebody goes and plugs their laptop in and it doesn't communicate with the projector. And if you have a 12-minute conference talk and you spend 6 minutes rebooting your computer and trying to communicate with the projector, you're not going to get extra time. You're getting your 12 minutes, and if you spend 11 of those minutes trying to communicate with the projector, the chairman of the session will just say, too bad, your time is up, we're going to move on. So always check that your laptop will communicate with the specific projector that you're going to be using at the meeting. And you know, we've had these problems for 20 years, and people will say, well, I checked it at home and it worked. You need to check it on the particular hardware at the meeting, because it varies, especially internationally. It varies all over the world. You know, don't worry. There's a temptation when you're nervous to go too fast. So try to slow down, and especially if you're nervous, try to breathe. You want to really be enthusiastic. Now, sometimes that's hard if this is your first conference talk and you're terrified. Maybe it's hard to be enthusiastic, but you should try to be playful, right? And in fact, you know, maybe you want to throw in some, make some comment or put a little bit of humor in good taste, of course, as much to help you to relax as it is to re-engage the audience. So trying to be playful and enthusiastic really, really helps. It's good to move around. Eye contact is really good. And using the pointer, you'll notice at the beginning, I didn't use the pointer, and that might have been a little bit, that might have not been good for some of you. Using the pointer, especially to point to slides that are complicated, is really, really helpful for people. Again, if somebody's talking about a slide and I don't know what figure on the slide they're talking about, I tend to tune out. So anytime you break that efficiency of communication, you risk losing your audience. Explain all the charts. This is a common mistake. You'll show a graph and you won't explain what the x-axis and what the y-axis is because you think it's so obvious. It's actually not obvious at all. Another thing to do, especially if you're nervous about questions at the end, it's good to repeat the question back to the questioner. That does two things. It confirms that you've understood what the question is, and it also buys you a little bit of time to try and dream up what you think the right answer should be. Now, of course, it's okay to say you don't know the answer. You don't want to, at a professional conference, you don't want to say things that you're not sure about. So you could sort of speculate about what the answer might be, as long as you're clear that it's a speculation. But you never want to take a wild guess at something. If you don't know the answer to something, it's better to say you don't know. Now, this idea of grabbing, I want to just spend the rest of the presentation showing some examples, and I've stolen, of course, the slides from my students who make much better slides than me. So this idea of starting to grab the listener's attention immediately, and that begins with the title slide. And I deliberately started off this with this very, very boring title slide. So if that's my title slide and I'm at a conference and there are 20 parallel sessions going, and you're not sure whether you want to listen to my talk or somebody else's talk, it may be when I show this slide that you walk out the room, that you think, oh, this is really boring. So people like to be entertained at the very beginning, and there's different approaches for doing this, and I'm just going to take you, just having something there to indicate that you're giving a talk, this might be some sort of deep, intellectual subliminal message there. I mean, people might say, well, why have they put a picture of a microphone there? You're trying to engage and get them thinking. Maybe what people often do will have an image of their geographical location. So I'm in Arizona in the Sonoran Desert. So I often use this slide, especially if I go to cold, rainy places or cold places. This kind of captures people's imagination. It communicates where I'm from, and it's beautiful to look at. You can try and introduce different types of humor and things like that onto your introduction. Again, it's a little bit risky. You'll notice, again, humor tends to be, some of you might recognize some of these figures from American TV shows. Again, if you go abroad and you show something from The Office, people might not understand that. So you need to be careful, again, when you're choosing humor to introduce a topic. Make sure that your audience will know that. If you decide to be political, again, that's like being religious. If you're going to put up an image of a distinguished Republican president, you should probably put up an image of a distinguished Democratic president in order to balance that. Usually it's better to avoid these kind of issues, but if there's a good reason for doing it, just be aware of balance. Very often something like this would work, where you would put up some figures, perhaps from the presentation, and that captures the imagination of the audience, especially, this is electron energy loss spectroscopy, and so people that might be sitting in a Niels session will look at this and they will recognize some of the features, and so that will kind of whet their appetite for what's to come. I think Ethan is online. This is one of Ethan's movies from in situ microscopy, where again it captures the imagination. People become curious, they see the atoms dancing around here and they wonder what the talk is going to be about. And so that's something which I think can really help. Animations can also help. I tend to use them sparingly. So for example, this is an example of Syria that's used in a catalytic converter, and the idea is, during the functioning of the catalytic converter, the oxygen is popping out of the lattice. So something very, very simple like that. Or again, another example from Ethan here, where he wanted to show the initial state of a particle and the final state of a particle. So he's subjecting the particle to different treatments. So here's the initial particle, here's the final one, here's the initial particle, and here's the final one. And by animating and introducing the elements in sequence like that, you can focus the audience's attention on the thing that you're talking about at the time. Whereas if I just showed this whole slide at once, people's eyes would wander around and they might get distracted, and then they might miss something that's important that you say. The other place where it's quite useful is if you do have, say, text. Maybe in this particular case, we have 3 different hypotheses, and in this presentation I might be talking about these hypotheses, and then at the end I might eliminate some of them. So you can simply, so for example, I can use this slide early on in my presentation, and then I can use the same slide at the conclusion, but now I put an animation over there to score out the hypothesis that I've shown to be wrong. So again, recycling the same slide but overlaying it with different animations is a good way of sometimes helping the audience see the connections between the different parts of your talk. Now, you have to be a little bit careful with animations. Some people get carried away with them, and so you want to sort of be careful not to overdo it. If you overdo it, it starts to become a bit annoying, and people start to become irritated, and then they'll check their cell phones or something like that. So you want to use animations sparingly and don't get carried away with them. Color is very helpful, especially if you want to present a fairly complicated slide. So for example, I won't go into all the details of what this is about, but there's a graph over here, which I would have to explain what the x-axis is, hydrogen production versus time. And I've colored the graphs, you know, black, red, and blue. And then I'm showing images, in this case, of the identical catalyst. And you'll see I've put an outline around the, sorry, some of these slides have moved, but you see I've put a blue, a red, and a black outline around the figures that would match those graphs. So that means that I'm using color to connect different things on the slide. And that, again, especially if I'm not paying attention to some of your words, if I see the color, I can immediately catch up. You know, I check my phone, I check my email, and then I look up. And if there's this colored association there, it's possible for me to catch up with the talk. Whereas if there's no color there, I might just lose and get lost at that point. Equations, usually it's best to avoid equations, but again, if you do have equations, try to, again, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if this, if you can see the whole graph here, but again, there's 3 equations here, and the equations are all plotted over here. And again, we've matched the color of the equation to the color on the graph here so that it's easy for people to see which is which. The other thing that you'll notice, and again, this is one of Ethan's, where he's colored in one of the variables in the equation in order to make it stand out, because that's the variable that we want to talk about. So that can really make something that's algebraically very dense. If you just color in the variable that's important, that helps to focus people's minds, and it stops them getting overwhelmed with all the algebra. Give your slides an informative title. Certainly when we write papers and things like this, we'll have the methods section, the analysis, and the results section. Those are actually not good titles for a slide, because methods or analysis or results doesn't communicate something to me. So here's an example of a slide showing the results, and it has the word result above there. And again, if you were sleeping when I came to this slide, there's really no way you know what the results are about. You know, you weren't paying attention, you were checking your phone, you were checking your email, and now I'm showing you the results and you don't know what the results are. Whereas if I change that to something like this, sorry, I'm not sure if this is the Zoom. Okay, hopefully you can see this, but basically this is a descriptive title now saying what the results actually are. And you should do that with all of your slides. Try to give each slide a descriptive title. Don't call it methods or analysis. Give it something that describes the method or describes the analysis. And that means as people are coming in and out of your presentation, because you know they're going to their phone and checking their email or checking their text, they can catch up and reconnect with you again. Here's an example of a terrible slide where I've used the same example I showed before, but now I've taken the figures straight out of the paper. And this is terrible because, first of all, there's a dense figure caption here, which hopefully you can't read very well because the writing is too small. And then the figures are labeled A, B, and C. So to know what the figures are, you have to go down to the figure captions to actually read the figure captions. And this is really a disaster in terms of connecting with your audience. Your audience are all going to go and check their phone at this point. They're just not. They're just going to sort of stop paying attention. So just to show you how that was done previously, here's the slide I showed you before, which has the same information, but where the figure is now modified for a presentation. So this works well in the manuscript because I can go and I can read the figure caption. I have time to study it. This is a much better scheme to use for a presentation. And then, of course, at the end, you should always give a summary or conclusion slide, because no matter how much you work at trying to engage your audience, a lot of them are not going to be giving you your full attention all the way through the presentation. And so giving that summary means that they wake up, they slept through all of the details, but they wake up during your summary and they can still end up learning something from your presentation, because the summary should have, and here's an example of a summary, you know, maybe 3 or 4 points on it, right? And don't make it too complicated. You know, you can have a sentence if you want, or just do bullet points. Very often my students say, oh, you have too many words, I should just go to bullet points. Something that is brief. I often highlight important words in the conclusion so that people can just look at the words that are important, but that really helps as well. So your got your first conference talk, you're preparing for it, it's useful to spend a lot of time on the preparation. So most people, when they're giving their first talk, many people like to write out the script. Just write it out in full and practice it. Now, that's a preparation tool just to get clear in your own mind what it is you want to say. And sometimes writing down the words is a good way to know exactly what you want to say. However, once you go and you start doing the final rehearsals for the talk, you want to avoid, you absolutely do not want to read the script. And you don't even want to memorize the narrative. The idea is that you've practiced this narrative and then you throw the narrative away and you just sort of ad lib. And the reality is most of the important points that you need to make are going to be on your slide and they will prompt you. And because you've practiced some of the words, the right words will come out of your mouth at the time. But you don't need to memorize the narrative word by word. Make sure you practice the timing to make sure that you really are doing 12 minutes. It really helps to do this practice in front of your peers. So for example, in my group, we always do practice talks, especially for new students, and we give them a lot of feedback on what kind of communication techniques worked, what kind of slides worked, how can they improve the presentation, how can they improve the explanation. So really, I would say for the first 2 or 3 conference talks, you want to make sure you spend a lot of time practicing. And you might become more skilled with time, and some people are better at this than others. Some people can do it very quickly. What I find is that everyone, all of the PhD students in my group, speak very well at the end of 4 years. So even if you find this very, very stressful at the beginning and you feel that you're not skilled at it, it's just a question of practice makes perfect. You just need more and more practice. And trust me, almost anyone can give a good talk if you practice enough. So lots of ways to make a good talk. Again, try to make it useful, try to tell a good story, try to keep your slides simple, don't overload them with content that's not required, and good luck, especially if you're doing your first conference talk this summer. And so now I'm happy to go into any questions that you might have.
Wonderful, thanks, Peter. Again, let's just have people type in the chat, and then if multiple keep coming up, then I'll start moderating that.
They were all sleeping.
They were all sleeping. They didn't
That's
see
usually what happens.
your jokes in there. All right,
I'm
I do have a question, so I'll start it off.
Sure.
On one of your slides, so you made a good point of only making a couple of points, but then you also talked about like having the correct order of slides, intro and all that, and then there's only really one result and then maybe like 2 interpretation slides. So how do you get across multiple points on a usually rather diverse set of data, because you have to put in multiple graphs and all that?
So this is what none of us like to hear. You have to chop stuff. So the key thing is, that you need to prioritize. And unfortunately, prioritizing means that you're going to not present some of the things that you've worked on. That's always tough because, of course, you've invested a lot and you would like to share all your findings with the audience. So I think you need to prioritize. You can, sometimes what you'll do is you'll say, oh, and we've worked on this particular area too. I don't want to go into the details of this, but if any of you are interested, I can talk to you at the end. That's a way in which you can communicate to maybe the specialist in the audience that you have some data that they might be interested in. And in fact, generally speaking, what I say to people when they're doing these presentations is you're almost designing the slide for 2 audiences. You're designing the slide for the general audience where you want everyone to get something out of what you're saying, but you also have maybe technical detail in there that the specialist might know. In fact, if I go back to the slide about the equations, that might be a good way to illustrate this. Because if I show, let me just share my screen again. share this one. Can you see that equation?
Yes.
So that equation, for example, if you look at this equation at the top, the knock-on one, there's, you know, it's not too complicated, but it's complicated enough for someone that's not seen it that they may not understand it. However, so when I'm talking about this equation, I don't talk about the details of the algebra. I talk about the three titles, the blue title, the green title, and the red title, and I give it in words. But for a specialist in the audience, they will also be looking at the equation. So this slide communicates in two levels. By using the color, I can communicate three processes to the general audience, but by putting the equation on the slide, I can communicate technical detail to the specialist simultaneously, but I don't need to speak that detail. So that's one way in which you can, so you could say that the colored words are the primary message of this slide, and then the algebra, the equations are a secondary message that I don't need to talk about in the presentation, but which specialists will be reading, and they may come up and talk to me afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So in something like this where there's an equation, you wouldn't even define most of the variables. You would just say,
no,
here.
That's right. And that was why I said that if you're, so we were talking about the vacancy formation energy in that equation. So that was the variable that was colored red, because that's the thing that we're talking about. And so again, in a paper, you would define all the variables, and every time you quote an equation in the paper, you'll define all the variables. In a talk, you don't often do that. Or you might define them, but you would again define them for the specialist. There would be a column of words over on the side defining all the variables, but I wouldn't speak it.
Yeah.
And again, that comes back to this issue of how many words do you want to have on a slide. Again, the answer really depends on what your objective is. Your objective is not to produce something that's necessarily just beautiful. Your objective is to communicate with the audience. And so that's important to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask it, or put it in the chat window. And if you don't know where the chat window is, it's at the bottom of the screen. You wave your mouse over, it says chat. There you go.
Okay, this is a typical Ethan question. What is your worst talk experience? Well, there have been so many. I'm trying to think. Well, I've had a few. Let me see. That I could think back to the day. I do remember I was giving a presentation at a meeting in California, and I did not. I didn't practice what I preached, and I didn't plug in my laptop into the projector until the coffee break, and all my slides were done 16:9 format, and this projector could only handle 4:3 format, and so we got the technician in during the coffee break, and it was not possible for the technician to fix that problem before I had to give my talk. And it wasn't even that they could shrink my 16:9 slides to fit on the screen. The 16:9 slides spilled over the wall right off the screen. And again, that was an example of, if I had checked it the day before, I could have reformatted my slides 4:3. So that's one unpleasant experience. And then, of course, you know, when you're traveling abroad all the time, sometimes you're going through 10 or 12 hours of jet lag, and so you'll be giving your talk when you're half asleep. That's usually not me at my best. But usually, actually, I don't have many bad experiences, and the key reason for that is preparation, and practice. So even the best speakers, trust me, they will be up in the room working furiously on their slides, practicing certain bits. I mean, for someone like me with a lot of experience, once you set me on the slide, I can sort of go into autopilot and I can present the words on the slide. The challenge for me is the connections between different slides. If I'm mixing slides together in different ways, how do you transition from one slide to the next? And that takes preparation. So as long as you prepare, you shouldn't really have a terrible experience.
Any other questions on how to give a great presentation? Peter has lots of experience. Don't be shy.
Please Please post if you slept through my. Please indicate if you didn't sleep or check your phone during my presentation, or check your email. How many of you did not check your phone or email during my presentation? Ethan checked his Snapchat 17 times. Eric has given a thumbs up, so he paid attention. Yeah.
Whew. A lot of sleeping.
Yeah. So I think only minimal sleeping, Anna Weiss. Thank you, Anna. You know, I think that goes back to this first, you know, maybe I can just go back to that, one of those early slides where you just have to accept the reality for what it is, which is, where is this thing? This slide here. I mean, this is the reality, right? So you pretty well have to assume that you're not going to stop people checking their phones. You're not going to stop people nodding off for a minute during your talk. So again, you need to design the effective communicator takes those factors into account. And you know, when I'm in class, you know, professors can order the students to put their laptops and phones away, but when you're at a conference, you can't. Everyone's going to be checking their email and checking their phone. So you have to constantly design the slides on the assumption that people are zoning in and zoning out all the time, and provide them with an opportunity to re-engage and make it easy for them to pick up. So if I miss a few of your slides, I should still be able to capture the thread of your presentation. Those are the things that make presentations good. Stop sharing, okay.
Okay. Do you want to make these slides available, I guess, or
I've put
if
some.
anybody wants them, they can email you?
Yeah, maybe. I put in some of those memes, and I have to confess I did it last night and didn't check the copyright. So don't do what I did there. You don't want to go to jail. I think there's a lot of stuff on the internet now which you're really supposed to, you know, is posted on all these anonymous sites, and I think we're all supposed to get, not necessarily permission, but you're supposed to always have a citation. Again, I can go to maybe this one here where, oh, maybe you can't see that. I forgot to share my screen again. But this one, if I just do this, this will be my last thing. Where you notice it says the New Yorker there. So that's the, and I think the one with Donald Trump said the Sun newspaper, it's a UK newspaper. So if you're going to use those kind of things, try and just make sure that you're absolutely sure that they're free to share. For example, Wikipedia, a lot of the Wikipedia stuff is free to share, and they'll tell you how you want to cite it. And if you're not sure about it, the larger the conference, then the more I would say don't take a chance by showing something that could get you into trouble.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you for speaking, and then thank you everybody who did attend.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
All right, and then we'll conclude the meeting. All right.
Okay, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Peter.